When my son told me I wasn't welcome at his house for Christmas, I didn't argue. I picked up my jacket, walked to my truck, and drove home. 2 days later, I had 18 missed calls. I didn't answer a single one. My name is Gerald Morales. I'm 61 years old. I run a flooring and home renovation business out of Spokane, Washington. Been doing it for over 30 years. Built it from a single truck and a set of hand tools. Lost my wife, Gloria, 6 years ago. Raised my son, Floyd, mostly on my own after that. I'm telling you this so you understand who I am before I tell you what I did. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early December. I drove over to Floyd and Lorraine's place to drop off some tools he'd borrowed. I wasn't planning to stay long. Floyd met me at the door. He looked uncomfortable before I even stepped inside. We sat down in the living room. Lorraine wasn't around. Floyd kept his eyes on his shoes for a moment, then finally looked up. "Dad, about Christmas this year. Lorraine's parents are coming. Her dad, Marvin, and her mom, Diane." "Sure," I said. "That's fine. I can bring Tommelies, same as last year." Floyd shook his head. "That's the thing. They'd prefer the gatherings stay smaller." I looked at him. "Smaller meaning what, son?" He didn't answer. Just looked back at his shoes. I sat there a moment. I looked around that living room, the hardwood floors I'd installed myself weekend after weekend on my knees with a nail gun. The kitchen I'd helped gut and rebuild when Lorraine decided the old layout wasn't working. The furniture that came from money I'd wired into their account when things got tight and Floyd's paycheck wasn't covering it. Every corner of that house had something of me in it. I stood up, grabbed my jacket off the armrest, and said, "Okay, that was it." I walked to my truck. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say anything else. I just drove home. Sitting in my driveway that evening, I didn't go inside right away. I just sat there with the engine off, watching the neighbors' Christmas lights blink on and off across the street. Normal family over there, kids running around inside. Nobody calculating whether their father was welcome at the table. I went inside eventually, poured a cup of coffee, pulled out the notebook I keep in my desk drawer, the one where I write everything down, contracts, estimates, payments. I'm old school that way. I opened it to a clean page and started adding numbers. $35,000 for their down payment. That came out of my home equity loan, the one I signed for because Floyd said it was just temporary, just until they got on their feet. $18,000 for the kitchen renovation, the one Lorraine said she needed because the old layout wasn't functional. $41,000 across 4 years covering their credit card debt, piece by piece, whenever the balance got too high and Floyd called sounding worried. And then the monthly transfers, $1,400 every month for 28 months straight, going toward utilities and groceries, while Lorraine's event planning business was getting started, and Floyd's salary wasn't stretching far enough. I added it up 3 times because I didn't believe it the first two, $94,000. That's what the 3 big chunks came to. The monthly transfers were on top of that, another $39,200 over 28 months. Combined, I had put more than $133,000 into that house and that life over the past 4 years. More than I had spent on myself in the same period. More than I had set aside for my own retirement in years. I closed the notebook and sat at that kitchen table for a long time. I thought about Gloria. Before she passed, she'd grabbed my hand one afternoon and said, "You give too much, Gerald. Always have. Make sure they know the difference between love and convenience." I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. I thought she was just talking in generalities, the way people do when they're tired. Sitting at that table, I understood exactly what she meant. I also thought about the way Floyd had looked at me in that living room, not angry, not even guilty, really, just uncomfortable, like a man delivering a message he'd rehearsed, like someone who'd been told what to say and was just getting through it. That was the part that stayed with me, not the exclusion itself. The rehearsal behind it. I'd watched Floyd change over the 3 years since he married Lorraine. It happened slowly, the way things that matter usually do. He called less. When we did talk, Marvin's name came up more and more. Marvin thinks the market's doing this. Marvin says I should look at that. Small things at first, then bigger ones. Career decisions, financial decisions. And now, apparently, decisions about who sat at the Christmas table. Marvin Caldwell had spent 3 years quietly making himself the authority in my son's life. And I had been so busy sending money that I hadn't noticed until I was standing in that living room holding my jacket, being told there wasn't room for me. I didn't sleep much that night, but by morning I had a plan. The first call I made that morning was not to Floyd, it was to Perry Nolan. Perry is a contractor I had worked alongside for close to 15 years. We had split jobs, shared equipment, covered for each other when one of us was shorthanded. He was the kind of man who told you the truth even when it was inconvenient, which is exactly why I called him. "Perry," I said, "you hearing anything strange about me from the business association people?" He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, Gerald, I was actually going to call you this week. I got an email about 10 days ago. Came from Marvin Caldwell. You know him? I knew the name. Marvin was Lorraine's father, retired branch manager from one of the regional banks. He sat on the board of the Inland Northwest Business Leaders Association, which was a group of maybe 80 local business owners and professionals who met quarterly and occasionally influenced who got contracts and who didn't. What did the email say? I asked. Perry read it to me over the phone. It was careful, no outright accusations, just enough insinuation to plant doubt. It said there were concerns in the community about Gerald Morales and his current financial stability, that some long-standing payment obligations had reportedly gone unmet, that members of the association might want to be cautious about entering into new agreements with my company until the situation clarified. I had just signed a $28,000 consulting contract with a property developer 2 weeks prior. That contract was my main income for the first quarter of next year. That email was designed to kill it before it got started. Forward it to me, I said. Perry sent it within the minute. I read it twice, then I called Stuart Greer. Stuart is a civil attorney I had used twice before for contract disputes. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary friction of running a small business for 3 decades. He was straightforward, didn't waste words, and knew how to read a situation quickly. I laid everything out for him. The financial support over 4 years, the Christmas exclusion, the email from Marvin targeting my professional relationships. Stuart listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. First, did I have documentation of the financial transfers, bank records, receipts, anything in writing? I had all of it. Every transfer, every receipt, every text message where Floyd had asked for help and I had agreed. It was all in folders in my filing cabinet, organized by year, because that is how I run my business and my life. Second, was there a written agreement clarifying the $35,000 down payment as a gift rather than a loan? There was not. It had been a verbal agreement. The way too many things between fathers and sons are. Stuart told me that without documentation establishing it as a gift, there was a reasonable legal argument that it functioned as an undocumented loan. That argument wouldn't guarantee a courtroom victory, but it would create enough pressure to matter. He also told me that the email from Marvin was potentially actionable as tortious interference with a business relationship. It was a deliberate attempt by a third party to damage an existing or prospective contract. The fact that I had it in writing forwarded directly from the recipient was significant. I told Stuart to start preparing the paperwork on both fronts. Then I hung up, went home and canceled the monthly $1,400 transfer that had been running for 28 months. No message, no explanation. I just stopped it. 2 days later, my phone started ringing. Floyd called 4 times the first afternoon, then Lorraine. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I found out later was Marvin's cell. By the end of that week, I had 18 missed calls logged on my phone. I did not answer one of them. I let them sit with the silence. What I did not know until later was that the silence had hit harder than I expected, because something else was happening at the same time. Lorraine had been in the process of applying for a new loan, a refinancing package to consolidate some of their remaining debt. She had listed Marvin as the secondary co-signer, which told me everything I needed to know about how long this transition had been planned. I was being phased out. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly replaced the way you replace a part that's been wearing down. When the monthly transfer stopped, the math on that loan application changed overnight. I did not feel satisfaction about that at the time. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to grief. Not for the money, for the years. For the Sunday afternoons I had spent worried about their utility bills instead of living my own life. For the fishing trips I had turned down because I was watching their account balance. For the repairs on my own house I had kept putting off because every spare dollar was going somewhere else. I had told myself it was love, and some of it was, but a lot of it was habit. The habit of making myself smaller so someone else could be bigger. I had done it for so long that I had stopped noticing it was happening. Perry called me midweek to ask how things were going. I told him to hold on to that email. I was going to need it. Stuart called me the following Monday with an update. The civil filing for the $35,000 was being prepared. It would go in as an unjust enrichment claim, which essentially argued that Floyd and Lorraine had received a significant financial benefit at my expense, without any written agreement establishing it as a gift, and that it would be unjust for them to retain that benefit without repayment. Stuart was clear with me. This was not a guaranteed win in court, but it didn't need to go to court to be effective. The filing alone would create legal pressure, put the amount on record, and require them to respond. The second piece was the complaint against Marvin. Stuart had drafted a formal letter to the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions. Marvin was a retired bank officer, and while retirement limited what the department could do, using former professional relationships to spread false financial information about a private citizen was the kind of conduct that regulators documented and took seriously. It wouldn't put him in handcuffs, but it would put his name in a file, and for a man whose entire identity in this city was built on professional reputation, that file would matter. I told Stewart to move forward on both. Then I asked him about Washington's recording laws. Stewart confirmed what I already thought I remembered. Washington is a one-party consent state. If I was a participant in a phone conversation, I could record it legally without telling the other person. I thanked him and hung up. Then I waited. Floyd had left 11 voicemails by that point. The tone had shifted across those messages in a way that told me a lot. The first few were confused, almost casual, like he thought I had just forgotten to return his calls. By the 5th or 6th, there was an edge to his voice. By the 11th, he sounded like a man who was starting to understand that something had changed and he didn't know how to stop it. I picked up on his 12th call. I kept my voice level. I didn't accuse him of anything. I asked questions instead of making statements. I asked him how things were going. I asked about the new loan application mentioned. I had heard they were refinancing. Floyd didn't ask how I knew. He just started talking, the way people do when they have been trying to reach someone for 2 weeks and finally get through. He said things were complicated. He said Lorraine's father had some strong opinions about how they should be handling their finances going forward. He said Marvin had suggested that relying on family support the way they had been was not a sustainable arrangement and that it was better for everyone to establish cleaner boundaries. I asked him whose idea it had been to keep Christmas smaller this year. There was a pause. Then Floyd said Marvin thought it would be easier, less friction. I asked him if he had agreed with that. Another pause, longer this time. I didn't argue it. Floyd said, I probably should have. That was enough. I had what I needed on record. I thanked him for calling, told him I'd be in touch, and ended the call. I sent the recording to Stewart within the hour. 3 days before Christmas, I opened the Spokane Review online and found my own name in a lifestyle piece written by a local editor named Beverly Norris. The article was short, maybe 400 words. It described a family in conflict during the holiday season. It did not use the word erratic, but it came close. It quoted Marvin Caldwell by name, describing him as a concerned family member trying to manage a difficult situation. It painted a picture of me as someone whose behavior had become unpredictable and hard to accommodate. There was no mention of $133,000, no mention of 4 years of monthly transfers, no mention of a Christmas exclusion delivered in a living room full of furniture I had paid for. No mention of an email sent to my professional contacts designed to undermine a contract I had just signed. I read the article twice. Then I called Stewart. He told me to gather every bank statement going back 4 years, every receipt I had, every record of every transfer. I already had them organized in my filing cabinet. I scanned them that evening and sent the full package to Stewart by 10 o'clock. He drafted a formal letter to the Spokane Review's editor, attaching the documentation and requesting a correction. The letter did not threaten a lawsuit. It simply laid out the documented facts alongside the claims in the published article and asked the editor to reconcile them. I also called Perry that night and asked him to make the original email from Marvin available as part of a potential follow-up complaint. Perry said yes without hesitation. I did not reach out to Floyd or Lorraine. I did not contact Marvin. I did not show up at anyone's door. I spent Christmas Eve at home. I made Gloria's red chile, the recipe she had written out in her own handwriting on an index card I still keep in the kitchen drawer. I ate at my own table. I watched a game on TV. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The filings went out on the morning of December 26th. 3 documents sent simultaneously by Stewart's office, the civil claim, the regulatory complaint, the letter to the Spokane Review. Then I made coffee and waited. The first thing that came back was the newspaper correction. Beverly Norris called me directly on December 30th. She introduced herself, apologized before I could say anything, and told me she had not known about Marvin's connection to the story when she filed it. She said a source she trusted had brought her the angle and she had not dug deep enough before publishing. She sounded genuinely embarrassed. I told her I appreciated the call and that I had no interest in making her the target of anything. She was a journalist who had been used. That was Marvin's doing, not hers. The Spokane Review ran a correction on January 2nd. It was short and factual. It noted that the original piece had omitted significant financial context relevant to the family situation described, and that the characterization of one party's behavior had not reflected the full circumstances. My name appeared in the correction the same way it had appeared in the article. This time, the context was different. Stewart told me the regulatory inquiry had been opened. The Washington State Department of Financial Institutions had acknowledged receipt of the complaint and assigned it a case number. That did not mean Marvin was in serious trouble. It meant his name was now attached to a formal complaint in a government file, which would show up in any professional background review from that point forward. For a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation in regional banking and business circles, that was not a small thing. What I did not know until Stuart told me was that Marvin had already made a move of his own. Within 48 hours of receiving the civil filing, he had contacted Floyd and Lorraine and told them he was withdrawing as co-signer on their loan application. No explanation given, at least not one Floyd shared with me later. He simply pulled out. Without Marvin's signature, the bank put the application on hold and requested that Floyd and Lorraine identify a replacement co-signer or provide additional collateral. They had 30 days to respond. Floyd called me 4 days into January. I picked up. He did not ask for money. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. He asked if he could come over. I said yes. He arrived that Thursday evening alone. He sat down on my couch and looked around the living room, the way people do when they are seeing something for the first time even though they have been there before. I had repainted the hallway in November, bought a new recliner, fixed the porch light that had been flickering for 2 years. Small things I had kept putting off because the money was always going somewhere else. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he noticed. "Dad," he said, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make big enough." I told him to just say what he needed to say. He talked for a while. He talked about the years since he married Lorraine, about how Marvin had positioned himself gradually, how every suggestion had seemed reasonable on its own, and how it was only looking back that he could see the pattern. He talked about the Christmas conversation, how Marvin had framed it as a practical decision, how Floyd had gone along with it, because he had gotten into the habit of going along with things Marvin suggested. He talked about finding out what Marvin had done with the newspaper and with the business association email, and how that had been the moment he understood that what he had been treating as guidance had actually been control. He said, "I let someone convince me that my own father was a problem to be managed. I don't know how I let that happen." I listened to all of it. When he finished, I sat quiet for a moment. Then I told him something true. I told him I had forgiven him before he walked through the door. That was not generosity. That was just the reality of being someone's father. The anger had burned off weeks earlier, somewhere around the time I was scanning bank statements at midnight. What was left was not anger. It was clarity. And clarity, once you have it, makes forgiveness easier than people expect. But I also told him that forgiveness was not the same as going back to the way things were. I gave him 3 things I needed from him if we were going to rebuild. The first was that he handled his own finances from that point forward. I was not a backup account. I would never be one again. If he needed help, he could ask me the way an adult asks another adult, not the way someone dials a number they know will always pick up. The second was that Marvin Caldwell had no role in any decision that affected my relationship with Floyd. Not directly, not through Lorraine, not through suggestions passed along secondhand, none. The third was that Gloria was never spoken about in a disrespectful way again, not by Lorraine, not by her parents, not by anyone in their circle. Gloria had worked hard her entire life and raised a son worth being proud of, at least before things went sideways. That was not open for reinterpretation by people who had never known her. Floyd nodded to each one. He said he understood. I told him that was a start. Lorraine called me once about 3 weeks into January. It was a short call. She said she was sorry for how things had gone. She did not get specific, which I understood. Getting specific would have meant naming things she was not ready to name. But the call itself took something, and I gave her credit for making it. I told her I appreciated hearing from her. I meant it. Lorraine was not the villain in this story, not the way Marvin was. She was a woman who had grown up with a controlling father and had learned to see the world through his framing. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And there is a difference between the two. What she chose to do going forward was her own business. She asked if there was a path forward for all of us. I told her the same thing I had told Floyd. Start with honesty. Build from there. That was the only foundation I knew how to work with anymore. The $28,000 consulting contract went through without any problems. The developer I was working with called me in mid-January to say he had heard some noise a few weeks back, but that it had gone quiet and he was glad we were still on track. I thanked him and didn't elaborate. Some things don't need explaining once they've resolved themselves. Perry sent me a message in late January. He said Marvin's name had stopped coming up in business association communications. Not with a bang, just quietly. The way influence tends to evaporate when the paperwork catches up with it. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I want to be honest about that. What I felt more than anything was tired in a way I hadn't let myself feel while everything was in motion. The kind of tired that comes after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down and your arms don't know what to do with themselves. I spent that Christmas with my sister Harriet and her family. She lives about 20 minutes outside of Spokane in a house that is not fancy but is always warm and always full of people who are genuinely glad to see each other. Her 3 kids are grown now, but they all came back for the holiday. Her youngest showed me a project he was working on, something to do with local geology. We talked about it for longer than either of us expected. I helped with the dishes after dinner. Nobody asked me to. I just did it because it felt right to be useful in a place where being useful was welcome. On the drive home that night, I thought about the last 4 years. Not with bitterness, just with the kind of clear-eyed accounting that feels possible once you're no longer in the middle of something. I thought about all the ways I had made myself convenient to people who were not thinking about my convenience at all. The Sunday afternoon spent anxious about someone else's bills, the tools I needed but didn't replace the fishing trips I turned down, the vacation I had been planning to take for 3 years and kept postponing because there was always something more urgent demanding the money. I had told myself it was love, and I still believe some of it was. But I also know now that a lot of it was just the path of least resistance. It was easier to write the check than to have the conversation, easier to absorb the cost than to draw the line, and I had been doing it for so long that I had stopped recognizing it as a choice. In February, I finally took that vacation. Nothing dramatic. 4 days in northern Idaho, renting a cabin near a lake. I had fished once with my father when I was about 12 years old. I brought a cooler, some books I had been meaning to read, and my old tackle box. I caught 2 fish the first morning and threw them both back. Sat on the dock in the afternoon and watched the light move across the water and did not think about contracts or filings or anyone's loan application. Gloria would have liked it up there. She always said the best thinking happened near water. I made her pozole when I got home. The recipe is on an index card in her handwriting, tucked in the kitchen drawer where it has been since she wrote it out for me about 15 years ago. I sat at my own table and ate it slowly and did not rush off to deal with anyone else's emergency. That was a good evening, one of the better ones in recent memory. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you have been writing the checks and absorbing the costs and telling yourself it is what family does, I want you to hear this. Knowing the difference between love and convenience is not a betrayal of the people you care about. It is the only way to find out who actually cares about you. The people who stay when the account is empty are the ones worth building around. Everyone else was just passing through on your dime. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There are more stories coming, and they are all worth your time.